Okay, welcome everyone to the 7th Annual Massachusetts Open Space Conference. We're thrilled that you're able to join us today for our second webinar, The Social Context of Your Community, Increasing Accessibility for All Residents. First, I want to say thanks to the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation for funding this conference through the Working Forests Initiative. I also want to thank the organizations that helped to plan the conference: University of Massachusetts Amherst, Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust, the North Quabbin Regional Landscape Partnership, Green Cambridge, and the Emerald Necklace Conservancy. Be sure to visit the Mass Open Space website to see our Open Space Handbook, to look at the recordings from last week's webinar, and to view information for upcoming Open Space Network events, such as our upcoming Mass Mapper training. This webinar, including the Q&A segment after the presentations, is being recorded and will be available for viewing after the conference. We'll also be sharing slides and other resources after the webinar, so you'll have plenty of time to peruse that at your leisure. And at the end of the webinar, we'll be sharing a feedback form that we encourage everyone to fill out. That's really important for making our future webinars and future conferences the best they can be. So, as you know, this year's Open Space Conference consists of webinars designed to help you think about how your community fits within larger contexts. Last week, we discussed the ecological context of your community. Today focuses on the social aspects of inclusivity and accessibility. And we hope that today's speakers and discussion will help you to create more equitable and accessible open spaces. We're joined by 4 wonderful speakers today: Dr. Neenah Estrella Luna from Star Luna Consulting, Lucas McDiarmid, Outings Leader with Latino Outdoors of Western Mass, and Jackie Diaz, the co-founder and ambassador of Latino Outdoors Western Mass. And then also Marjorie Holmen, the author of Finding Easy Walks Wherever You Are. So our first speaker today will be Dr. Estrella Luna. First, I want to issue a correction to some of our previous communications. Google misinformed us about Dr. Estrella Luna's affiliation. She's not been a professor at Northeastern for 5 years. She has a busy practice as the owner and principal of Star Luna Consulting, an anti-racism and social equity research, education, and consulting firm. Dr. Estrella Luna is a researcher, educator, advocate, and consultant focusing on issues related to social justice, social relations, and democratic governance. She works with grassroots organizations and policymakers to develop and advocate for policies and practices that support social equity in law and policy. Dr. Estrella Luna also provides opportunities to organizations and communities to learn how they can contribute to dismantling white supremacy and other structures of bigotry in their spheres of influence. She's also an active member of the Massachusetts Advisory Committee for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. After 15 years in academia, Dr. Estrella Luna is now the principal of Star Luna Consulting, an anti-racism and social equity research, education, and consulting firm. We're thrilled to have her here with us today. Take it away, Dr. Estrella Luna.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. Let's get this screen up. All right, so hopefully you all can see that and you can hear me. Yes, great. Let me just move you out of the way because you're in the way of my notes. So hello and thank you for having me. I am, as was mentioned, I am a researcher, I'm a policy advocate, and I'm going to be combining those two in the presentation that we have today. So I've got 3 main messages that I hope you will walk away with today. The first very important main message is that people of color, low-income people, and limited English speakers in New England and Massachusetts in particular have the least access to protected open spaces. And we'll go over some research that shows that. And in addition to that, inclusion and belonging is just as important as physical access. So we'll talk about that and why that is. And then finally, as a policy person, public policy and practice is either the root cause of these inequities and or an underutilized tool to address them. And so we're going to talk about all those 3 things, and hopefully you walk away with those to think about going forward. So to start, having access to open space is an issue of environmental justice. Now, what that means is that this issue is actually a civil rights issue. So as you hear us today talk about the need or desire of people to engage in open spaces for our health and well-being, that is important not just because it supports our health and well-being, but also because historically excluded and currently marginalized and oppressed groups are systematically denied what others are able to take for granted. So we have a moral, if not legal, obligation to dismantle these disparities. So the foundation to access is physical access. I think we all recognize that. And we have 40 years of research that shows that people of color, low-income people, immigrants, other marginalized groups have been systematically denied access to green spaces, to parks, other protected open spaces. Now, most of the way that has happened is in the modern era, okay, so post mid-20th century, is that many open spaces are sited in areas where white or wealthier people live or have access to. Now, here's the interesting thing. Over the past 30 years, New England, the 6 states of New England, have added more than 5 million acres of protected open space. That's not a small chunk of change, right? That's a lot of land. And this raised a lot of questions that my colleagues, Kate Sims and her student Margot Lurie at Amherst College, and Jonathan Thompson and Lucy Lee at Harvard Forest, I saw you on the list. Hi y'all. We all decided to explore. Now, one of the things that we looked at is whether that increase, that 5 million acres in increased land protection, also increased access to open space for environmental justice communities. Now, when you define an environmental justice community, it has to take into account the local context because the targeted groups shift depending on geography. For New England, these are the 4 main characteristics that we looked at, that researchers typically look at. And for those who are curious, people of color does include those who identify as Native American. Now, we also looked at access to public and private land, as well as, when that land became protected, so pre and post 1990. And in terms of the physical access, what we looked at was the percent of land protected either within a census tract or within a 1 kilometer radius of that census tract. But we also wanted to see, how this might change at different radii. So we looked at 1, 2, 10, and 25 kilometer radii. Now, we looked at a bunch of other really interesting things. These are the ones that I'm going to focus on today. So what did we find? In short, we continue to have disparities in access to protected open spaces all across New England. Communities in the lowest income quartiles, right? These are the communities with the highest concentrations of low-income people, have half as much nearby protected land as those in the highest income quartiles. Communities with the highest proportions of people of color have less than 60% as much protected land as those in predominantly white communities. And the pattern holds when we look at education levels and language isolation. So the less educated have less access, and limited English speakers have less access. Now, we see this quite clearly, and probably unsurprising for some of you, in areas like Cambridge and Emerald Necklace, which they're hosts today, so I thought I'd bring this up. This is a screenshot from an interactive map that we put together as a companion to our paper, and I'll put a link to that in the chat in a bit. But what you see here is in those patterned areas. So the green areas are the protected open spaces. The patterned areas are where we find the highest percentile of the different environmental justice groups. Okay. The highlighted areas that you see on the screen are where you find high concentrations of multiple groups with the lowest proximity to protected land. Now, our stereotypes of urban spaces might say, well, I don't find this surprising because these are urban spaces. Of course, urban places don't have open spaces. As you can see, there's a lot of green in there. In addition to that, though, we see these same kinds of patterns across Massachusetts and the region. And we have very high levels of protected open space in Massachusetts. So here is the Mount Grace Land Conservation Area. I don't have it outlined, but this is generally where it's at. And the green, as we say, the green areas are those protected open spaces. The area with the green dots are the census tracts with the highest proportion of low-income people. So you have vulnerable groups, historically marginalized groups in this area, excuse me, that very likely do not have the same kind of access, easy access to protected open space that I know the folks at Mount Grace Land Conservation would like to have for all peoples. Now you see these high priority EJ populations, the ones where there's multiple concentrations of marginalized groups with the lowest access to protected open space. We see this all across the region. So it's not just a Massachusetts problem, it's a problem of New England. And frankly, it's a national problem. So to answer our question, had those 5 million additional acres of protected open space since 1990 increased access or benefited EJ communities? The answer is no. These, and by the way, these disparities persist across different distances. So we were primarily focused on a 1 kilometer radius within a census tract. If you assume that everyone had a car, which is a ridiculous assumption, but if you assumed that, the same patterns persist. Low-income people, people of color, and limited English speakers, low-educated folks have the least access to protected open spaces in New England. These disparities also persist across public and private lands. And if you noticed, if you're one of the kind of people that can read those little bar charts that I put up earlier, you would notice that it was worse, access was worse on those private protected lands, which calls into question a lot of our policies that emphasize private land conservation over public land protection. Now, of course, I get asked this question all the time as a researcher and consultant, like, why? How did we get here? Primarily racism. Primarily races, secondarily classism are the reasons why these disparities exist. We have historic and ongoing housing discrimination that has created a segregated landscape where most cities and towns outside of central cities have populations that are more than 80% white. Interestingly enough, too, white dominant communities that are predominantly white are also income segregated. So you have predominantly white high income communities and predominantly white low income communities. So that housing segregation, the racial and class housing segregation, also fosters employment and education discrimination and segregation, which then reinforces housing segregation. Now, this housing segregation has been partly created through what we know historically, federal and state laws, and overt, what we call, law people like myself call de jure discrimination. But it's also in the modern era created through exclusionary zoning policies, including the use of conservation spaces as a mechanism for preventing the construction of housing, particularly low multifamily housing. Conservation spaces, by the way, have also been used to deny or to continue to deny access rights to Indigenous nations. So these are ongoing, they're historic, but they're ongoing forms of exclusion that are rooted in racism and in classism. But here's the other thing. Physical access is necessary, but it is not sufficient to support the use of open spaces. Spaces that are designed to exclude, either explicitly or implicitly, will not be used by people even if they can get there. Now, a lot of this has to do with how your spaces are designed, the kinds of programming and activities that happen in those spaces, and then the signals of inclusion and exclusion inside and outside of your spaces. So what you see here on the screen are the major ways that have been documented through research and other initiatives that I've been a part of, that open spaces become underutilized, even by local communities who would otherwise have physical access. Now, Marjorie is going to talk about the mobility issues. Jackie and Lucas will be talking about language access in addition to other things. So I'm going to leave that to them. But what I'd like to do is to give you some examples of ways in which you might be inadvertently sending signals to people that they are not wanted there. So let's talk about activities and programming. So this is actually this is a sign in my local park. I live here in East Boston, Massachusetts, so it's an urban space. What we have here are the park rules, some of which are fairly standard: no alcohol, no loud music. Nicely translated into Spanish. This is I live in a Spanish-speaking immigrant community. Now, this park, Women's Street Park, is a massive park. It's 18 acres. Okay. The two pictures that you see on the right are just where that little blue square that's flashing on the screen right now, just that little part of it. That's what you see in those, that massive green space there. Now, take a look at that space and let's go look at one of those rules. One of those rules that you may or may not have noticed was you are not allowed any kind of ball playing in this park. And to make this really abundantly clear, in this predominantly Latin American immigrant community, in these massive grassy spaces, you are not allowed any kind of ball playing. No baseball, no football, no American football, no volleyball, no balls, no balls. I'm not sure what you're supposed to do in these massive spaces. Now, some of you might say, oh, well, you know, you can have picnics. Okay. Fair enough. But what's not on that sign, but also not allowed without a permit, are tents. No pop-up tents, no canopies, none of that. So if you wanted to have a picnic in the middle of summer in this space, no shade for you, unless you want to go under those trees. And I live here, I can tell you it gets pretty crowded in the summertime. So then who is this space designed for? Is it actually designed for the community that actually lives near this park? The signal here is that no, not really. Not the only thing, the space is designed for people who want to walk around, who want to sit under the trees, and where you see the families concentrated is in the park, the playground areas of the spaces, and they get really crowded. Now, so that's one way in which you might be sending signals about who belongs in what spaces. Now, safety is an important characteristic of any open space. I can go on all day about that, but for people of color, for immigrants, and for Indigenous people in particular, open spaces are often places where they are harassed by police. And this is too often at the behest of white people, in particular white women. And just so you know, it only takes one experience like this to develop a reputation that your space is, that certain people don't belong in your space. Now, in addition to that, you have naming conventions. The names of places, the names of spaces within your places also send signals about how you think about people. For those of you who don't know, the term squaw is considered offensive. And if you have that in any of your place names, I suggest you start a process to change that as soon as possible. Naming conventions like what we see here on the lower left, Black Jimmy Pond, is also a reminder about who has the right to the respect of a proper name. Now, I originally come from California. What I find interesting is here in Massachusetts, water bodies that are named after people, after white people, are often use the person's last name. So also in Plymouth, there is Hathaway Pond, right, named after a Hathaway family. If a first name is used, it's just usually the first name. So again, in Plymouth, you have Ezekiel Pond. It's not Puritan Ezekiel Pond, it's just Ezekiel Pond. People of color have historically been denied the respect of proper names or honorifics, and naming conventions like this reinforce that legacy. Now, as I mentioned before, signs outside your spaces also affect the sense of belonging to those spaces. Now we've seen there are these highway markers and other monuments all around Massachusetts, frequently on public roads on the way to public open spaces. This Johnson Massacre sign is on Route 12 in Oxford, Massachusetts. If you get off I-395 and head south to go to Memorial Beach, for example, which is in Webster, you would pass that sign. And if you were an Indigenous person, this would be one of those frequent reminders that this space not just was taken from you, but is not for you. And by the way, just so you know, we should have learned by now, this is one of the functions of signs and monuments like these. They tell us whose stories matter and whose do not. And we have anti-Indigenous signs like this and naming conventions like we saw in the previous slide, all across Massachusetts, all across New England. Now this happens because of both historic and ongoing active biases, active discrimination. But we also have passive neglect and indifference. People just say, well, this is just how things were done. It is also true that segregation, that historic and ongoing segregation, both race and class segregation, feed and reinforce those biases. But one of the things that you need to know is that for people of color and for people from other marginalized groups, when passive neglect or indifference is used to support resistance to change, it is no different than active bias. Now, public policy is often the root of these kinds of disparities and challenges. We have historic and current policies that create and reinforce these problems of disparity and access, as well as the treatment of people in those spaces. Public policy is also responsible for the larger social context that determines who feels like they are entitled to the spaces, who feels entitled to exclude people from spaces. Now, these are just a few of the things that you see on the screen. These are just a few of the things that I work with my clients and advocates, and most common things that come up when we are trying to create more equitable and inclusive public open spaces. What I want to call your attention to is that last bullet about whether you have written policies. When you don't have written policies, you are leaving to discretion what happens in your spaces. And that discretion will be influenced by both conscious and unconscious biases, which is why we often work on writing down public policy and training people to enforce those policies. Now, this is all totally changeable. Our biases were created by humans and they can be unlearned and uncreated. And our public policies that reinforce and reproduce those biases and these disparities created by humans and can be changed by humans. And I'm going to show you a couple of concrete examples of that really quickly. So I had nothing to do with these. These are not my projects, but I do like these as these are the kinds of examples of both bold, but also super low-hanging fruit action that we do need today. So shout out to the trustees for changing the name of the peak at Monument Mountain in Great Barrington. For those of you who didn't know, it was previously called Squaw Peak, which you now know is an offensive term. Also shout out to the Yarmouth Conservation Trust for assisting the Native Land Conservancy in holding the conservation restriction for this donated land. Now, these are things that land trust and potentially municipalities can do or at least help make happen to address these problems of disparities in access and utilization. So really quickly, finally, what can you do? So at the most basic level, continued learning, okay, absolutely critical. You need to read the books, listen to the podcast, watch the documentaries, and more importantly, learn about the history of the spaces that you occupy and how that exclusion has been created, ideally from historically excluded and currently marginalized peoples. Also very importantly, please review and then strengthen your policies and practices, particularly in relation to policing. And most importantly, learn to work with and collaborate with your community-based organizations and also tribal nations. Learn how to take direction from historically excluded groups so that you can better support their needs, goals, and aspirations. So with that, I thank you for your time. I'm going to go ahead and pass this back to Alex.
Technical difficulties. Couldn't find the mute button. Thank you so much for that really wonderful, informative, and thought-provoking presentation, Dr. Estrella Luna. Next, I'll be introducing Jackie Diaz and Lucas McDiarmid of Latino Outdoors. Jackie Diaz is the co-founder and ambassador for the Western Massachusetts chapter of Latino Outdoors. She has helped to facilitate conversations regarding inclusivity in the outdoors and Western Mass since the inception of the chapter. As the ambassador for LOMA, Jackie manages the group's social media presence, where she advocates for science communication, rewriting the outdoor narrative, and outdoor recreation tips and tricks for beginners. Diaz recently completed her master's program in environmental conservation from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, with a focus on environmental policy and human dimensions. Lucas McDiarmid is an outings leader with the Western Mass region of Latino Outdoors. He joined LOMA in the spring of 2021, helping to plan and execute the region's Latino Conservation Week celebrations. As a member of LOMA, Macdiarmid is an advocate for equality and accessibility in open and green spaces. Since 2019, Macdiarmid has been a staffer with the Massachusetts Senate, supporting communities in central and western Massachusetts. He's active in the community through his work with LOMA, Big Brother and Big Sisters of Hampton County, and as a member of the Town of Palmer Conservation Commission. Macdiarmid holds a bachelor's degree from the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts in Political Science and a master's degree from Norwich University in Public Administration. We're thrilled to have him with us today, and I believe up first is Jackie.
Hello. Okay, let me share my screen. Can you all see that? It looks good? Yes? Okay, cool. So, hello everyone, good afternoon. Today I'm going to be talking about inclusivity in the outdoors and give kind of an introduction to Latino Outdoors Massachusetts. Lucas will then touch on some barriers and challenges we face in the outdoor world here in Massachusetts. So first, I'd want to start us off by going over our mission statement so that you have a frame of reference for what we are attempting to implement here in Massachusetts. So through Latino Outdoors, we inspire, connect, and engage Latino communities in the outdoors and embrace cultura y familia as a part of that outdoor narrative, ensuring our history, heritage, and leadership are valued and represented. And then kind of like stepping into this greater sense, what is our vision statement and our kind of like our ideal world, you know? So a world where all Latino communities enjoy nature as a safe, inclusive, and welcoming place. A world where the outdoors is a place to share and celebrate these stories, knowledge, and culture, while also growing leadership and an active community of Latino outdoor users, mentors, and stewards. So I kind of want to go a little back in time real quick and give a little history lesson of Latino Outdoors. So our founder, Jose Gonzalez, created Latino Outdoors in 2013 as a blog and online networking platform for members of the Latinx community interested in conservation, outdoor recreation, and environmental education to go to. A year later, they began going on outings with families and individuals while continuing, excuse me, I don't know what's going on with my voice this morning, while continuing to celebrate the multifaceted Latinx outdoor identity. Since then, Latino Outdoors has grown from a California-based organization to this national community, now present in 27 locations throughout the country. We are a part of that nexus between the movements for social justice, conservation, and the environment, and equitable access to the outdoors. The programmatic pillars of Latino Outdoors are the outdoor experiences, outdoor narratives, and outdoor leadership. Our three flagship programs complement each other and lead to the success of one another. So Vamos Outdoors fosters outdoor engagement, which leads to personal stories of connection to the outdoors. Those stories are then amplified through Yo Cuento Outdoors, which reaches greater audiences and inspires new and renewed outdoor engagement. In turn, Vamos Outdoors participants and Yo Cuento audience members are often then inspired to join Latino Outdoors Volunteers Network like Lucas and I, where they have the opportunity to grow and evolve as leaders in the outdoors through Crecemos Outdoors, while then contributing also to Vamos and Yo Cuento. I think my mouth is just really dry. So our outings framework, which you see here, weaves aspects of cultura, community, wellness, and connection into outings. So people to people connects people to each other in the outdoors, fostering that sense of community. People to place connects people to the place they are experiencing, creating that sense of place. People to process connects people to the process of going outdoors safely and enjoyably, initiating that self-empowerment that gets people to come back to the place. And lastly, people to policy connects people to the actions and issues surrounding policy that affect the outdoors, providing people with the tools to be advocates for themselves. So providing Latinx communities with increased opportunities to access public lands, other open spaces, and outdoor activities, as well as see themselves better represented in these spaces, will shift the demographics of conservation constituencies so that they better reflect what the country looks like. And this also leads to the decolonization of nature and rewriting that traditional outdoor narrative. So to give you a bit of background behind our chapter here in Western Mass, we founded the chapter, Sebastian Moreno and I, in Western Mass because of the great population of Latinx identifying folks in Springfield, Chicopee, and Holyoke. But not only that, but that's just where we live. We live in Western Mass. We wanted to foster that sense of community here. And since that time, we were founded in October 2020, we have onboarded 5+ more volunteers to join our efforts and provide this opportunity in Massachusetts in general. And so getting started in a pandemic, though, is kind of hard. But programs like Latino Outdoors' initiative of Together Apart kind of made it easier at the beginning. So that was our first event that we ever held, was in December 2020, and it was Together Apart. It was primarily held over social media, where we shared resources on how to bird, what types of birds you may see, where you could bird, kind of just like the ins and outs of how to get started doing that. But the beautiful thing about Together Apart is that I could do it here in Western Massachusetts, but someone else in California could be doing it at the same time as me. And so we have that shared bonding of doing the same activity, even though we're thousands of miles apart. But then last year, we have built upon our foundations here in Western Mass and through Massachusetts as a whole. And we have had many great opportunities to have in-person events as COVID restrictions have loosened, and we have the ability to wear masks and get vaccinated and whatnot. But a few points to highlight is the Latino Conservation Week that's held in July. We had 2 events, one in Holyoke, one in Ludlow. Then we celebrated Hispanic Heritage Month in September and October. And we also, our most recent event that we had with some partners was a community bird count that took place in Holyoke on a very cold winter morning in January. But one event that I wanted to shed some light on that I think was our most successful event to date was our bird walk that took place in Forest Park in Springfield. And if you haven't been to the park, I highly recommend it. It's a very beautiful little alcove. I mean, it's not even little, it's like that. It's like a very big park, but it's a very nice place to walk. We hosted 2 guided walks there, birding walks near the ponds in the park, and had an overall great turnout. We even saw 2 great blue herons, which was the first time I've ever seen them in person. And it was just amazing to be there and getting that sense of community. And my favorite part, though, was that we had folks coming up to us in the park that were just on their morning walks, who were a part of the Springfield community, a part of that Latino community in Springfield, and they were coming up to us asking us what we're about, what we're doing, like just general questions of wanting to get involved. And it really kind of like opened my eyes and being like, yes, there is that need for us to be here, be in person, be seen in the community, because it's just very important. People were really excited about us being there. So I'm now going to, after giving my ad spiel about Latino outdoors and how excited I am about it, I'm going to pass it over to Lucas to talk a little bit more about why it is so necessary for groups like ours to exist in Massachusetts. So I don't know, Alex, if you want to spotlight Lucas now.
Hello, everyone, and thank you to the Open Space Network and to all of the attendees today for allowing me to be here with Latino Outdoors. I'm going to share my screen now. I want to thank Jackie for that great introduction to our organization, and Dr. Estrella Luna for her great words and advocacy. So what I'm going to do here is walk us through a few points. We're going to talk a little bit about Latinos in nature, communities in nature, nature in urban spaces, the barriers that exist in these spaces, the benefits, and then green and open spaces as necessities in climate change. So as we're looking at urban spaces, something that we're looking at is a lack of accessibility. Part of that is transportation, whether it's available and accessible public transportation, walking distance. The Latino population is 19,800,000 individuals, according to our most recent data, and only 33% of that population is within walking distance of green or open space. Historically, Latinos have been an outdoor people, so there's a lot of narrative that we have to kind of move around. Some of that narrative has been very negative in terms of who belongs in green and open spaces and why. And then as Dr. Estrella Luna pointed out earlier, the policies around park placement and green and open space placement. So these are supposed to be spaces for all, but what we run into are language barriers, very serious and very real problems for communities of color and non-English speaking communities. Lowe has actually taken a new interest or a renewed interest in this kind of effort, most recently testifying before the Metropolitan Beaches Commission, submitting written testimony explaining why this is such a big deal. One thing that we're focusing on is that in addition to Spanish, there are 10 additional languages that the Department of Public Health has recognized as top tier languages for non-English speaking as a first language individuals, excuse me. And one thing that we're doing is we're talking about public reception and perception about languages. There's still a significant pushback when it comes to providing language signage in individual languages. We're talking about making sure that there are safety guidances, public outreach and education provided equally in a way that folks feel is culturally appropriate. When we talk about making sure that signage is up, we need to make sure that the languages being utilized are one, using language that's familiar to the individuals, excuse me. And then we're talking about the institutional inequities that exist in making sure that that process happens. There's also, we understand that there are funding issues, but there are ways to get around that. There are community organizations that should be partnered with. And that's what Lowe, especially in Western Mass, is doing. We are creating a place at the table, and in many cases, we are bringing that table to the conversation for our community. So Latinos benefit from access to green and open space, and that's not only just a qualitative approach, but that's been statistically proven. When we look at the benefits, we're talking about community development. So we're talking about creating a sense of belonging. We're talking about economic empowerment for any kind of shops that might be community owned or community member owned. We're talking about community resource awareness. That's what's happening in the open space, in the parks. And we're talking about social growth. Then as we get into it a little bit deeper, we're talking about the mental and physical health benefits of having green and open spaces available and in a way that they can be appropriately utilized. So 10 million or 16% of the Latino population in the US suffers from some form of mental illness. when we have these spaces available to our community members, we can combat some of those symptoms. We can ensure that the impact is a little bit less for them. And then when we talk about physical health, we're talking about access to the open space and how it encourages better health habits. So if you look at health data, you'll know that high cholesterol, diabetes, these are all things that tend to be disproportionately impacting communities of color and the Latino community in specific. But if we have these open spaces, these green spaces that are accessible, folks can get out there. So we can have sports. But again, as Dr. Estrella Luna pointed out, we have to make sure that the green spaces within these parks are able to be used. You can't have a field where folks can't get out there to play soccer or football or baseball and feel prohibited. You have to make sure that these spaces are welcoming. So then we're talking about sports, we're talking about bike paths, we're talking about some of these bigger parks that have hiking trails within them. And then what we're also seeing is that we can reduce crime. If we have a community space, a green space, an open space, a park, something that can be utilized by the community, that helps reduce crime in that area. And that comes kind of in keeping with what Dr. Estrella Luna pointed out earlier about policing. And when we have these spaces, we can reduce the impacts of gangs, we can reduce the impacts of petty crime, and we're encouraging better interactions with people, with animals, with wildlife. And we know that youth development is critical when it comes to how they're taught to interact with other people and other living beings. So parks as policy, what we're talking about is, as was mentioned earlier, the unequal distribution. So there are so many different ways in which the state, the municipalities, the federal government could be, investing in parks, and unfortunately, we just don't see that same return in communities of color, and it's very disproportionate. So what we're seeing more commonly now is community-based solutions. As an example, Jackie mentioned our Latino Conservation Week efforts. We held an event in Holyoke to draw out our community, to help educate them, to expose them to something. And what was truly sad for us was that we had folks who attended from our community who had no idea that there was a park this close to them that they could come to, who had never been to some of the facilities in the park. Most specifically, if you've been to a Memorial Field, it's called Scott Tower. It's a walking trail that leads up to an old tower that you can climb. But folks were not aware of that. They didn't feel welcome. They didn't know it was there that they could even go utilize. So that's where we get into the usage. How do we get people out there? I'm going to share a little anecdote. We've had folks say to us, "Oh, you're going to have a hard time organizing your community. You're going to have a hard time getting people out there." And it's a very negative way to frame how we organize our communities. It's hard to organize a community to get out anywhere, but you can't isolate that to one community based on their exposure or how they've been treated in a space. And then when we talk about amenities versus necessities, we're going to get into a little bit more about climate change, because we can't talk about this without talking about climate change. Parks provide a form of urban respite. Open spaces, it doesn't matter what kind of space it is. We're talking about a place where folks can escape to. We're talking about ways to mitigate the impacts of climate change, like stormwater. If there's a way for the water to be reabsorbed into the earth, we're helping to prevent communicable diseases. We're talking about things like West Nile virus and reducing other arboviruses. We're talking about heat vaporization and reducing the impact of heat islands, where our communities tend to live in much more condensed neighborhoods, and where folks are more disproportionately impacted by those high temperatures and impacts of climate change. So in addition to that, what we're looking at these green spaces as community spaces, but also as a form of community health and wellness protection. And it's critical for the community to be able to combat climate change and have that access. So, and again, as I mentioned before, climate change disproportionately impacts these communities of color. They're more likely, as I mentioned before, not to live within walking distance. They're more likely to be living in high capacity housing in large buildings surrounded by other large buildings. So as we talk about this, as Lo gets more and more involved in these discussions, that's what we're going to be focusing on. So again, I want to thank the Open Space Network for allowing us to be here today. I want to thank all of the attendees and the other speakers as well. And I'm going to turn it back over to Alex now.
Thank you so much, Lucas and Jackie. That was a really informative presentation, and we're thrilled to have Lo here with us today. Next, I'll be introducing Marjorie Turner Holmen. She's a personal historian who loves the outdoors and is the author of numerous Easy Walks books. She's been a freelance writer for numerous local, regional, and national publications for the past 20 years, has helped numerous families to save their stories, and has recorded multiple veterans' oral histories, now housed at the Library of Congress. And let me get your slides up, Marjorie.
Thank you. And thanks for having us.
Of course, we're thrilled to have you here. All right, everybody should be able to see that. Oh, am I on the right? Ah, goodness gracious. All kinds of technical difficulties today, and nobody pay attention.
Up to the top.
My
There you-
apologies, folks. I started on the wrong slide. Apologies. Well, y'all got a little sneak preview.
All right. Okay, we're going to be talking about making trails more accessible with those with mobility, visual impairments, and other challenges. And I am Marjorie Turner Holmen, marjorieturner.com. I've got over 500 blog posts, most of which are focused on easy walks. A lot of them are my travels. I live in Bellingham, Massachusetts, which I describe as South Central. So I'm not urban located. I'm actually have a lake right near here, closer to Providence. So I'm sort of Rhode Island focused, but I do get around to lots of other places with support of family and friends. So we can turn to the next slide. I've kind of pioneered the concept of easy walks that are capitalized. And so I wanted to describe or help to define first off what easy walks are, because typically when somebody says, oh, that's an easy walk, mostly what I have found is that they mean it's under 3 miles, and very few people who don't have mobility issues take into account what the trail surfaces are like. And for those of us who have mobility and or visual impairments, the trail surface has a huge amount to do with access or not. So I give you this example, not to say that's the only trail, but this picture is not an easy walk, as you can probably guess, but for people who have regular functioning ankles and regular functioning legs, they're doing fine. But I look for not too many roots, not too many rocks, solid footing that is firm packed, and that includes beaches, and relatively level and something of interest along the way. That's what makes an easy walk. Distance has to do with your stamina, and that is quite variable within the disability community. Some people have more stamina, lots of people have less, and so distances have to be personally decided upon. It isn't that you can control what that is, but you can tell people this is a loop trail. So if you keep going, you will go all around, but it helps to know how far that loop is. Because if you get halfway and find out, oh, I have to go all that way around, or you can return, it just helps to make planning. Typically, it helps to know what you're getting into before you do, or at least have as much information as you can so that the person with a disability can make their own decision about what is appropriate for them. We can move to the next slide. Alex, can you move the next slide? Thank you. My target audience that I tend to aim for, and I have a Facebook group that's actually quite active for those with mobility and visual impairments. They typically, I focus on older adults, families with very young children, and those with cognitive challenges, as well as mobility and visual impairments. So accessible trails come in many shapes and sizes. And I heard reference before asking about ADA limitations and how hard, especially in hillier Western Massachusetts, that's a problem. And there are several things that can address that. The truth is, you cannot make every trail accessible, nor is there an expectation for those in these communities that they must be able to go in every single trail. It's just not possible. But there are many places that you can make a difference, say with a hill that instead of going straight up, you can make the path go slowly up the hill and have curves and slowly make your way up the hill. That's where trail building can have a huge impact on accessibility. In fact, building trails that way encourages less erosion and less, it makes so less repairs for trails if you make it more accessible for all. So let's see some examples of the different kinds of trails that I have found that are pretty accessible. I call them handicapped friendly because they are not all ADA accessible, but I call them handicap friendly because there's a lot about them that make it so many people can access these trails. Can we move to the next slide? A number of there's Army Corps of Engineers properties, especially in Eastern Mass, and I couldn't tell you how many are in Western Mass. And the tops of those dams, well, the Quabbin Reservoir, but that's more Central Mass still than Western Mass. But the Army Corps of Engineers has built amazing dams. And then, of course, because of having these dams, unless they're in active use because there's a flood, those floodplains that are where they're built to absorb that extra water make ideal walking paths. The Army Corps of Engineers needs to drive to maintain these. And so they're wide, which is a great help for those with mobility challenges. They're relatively level. These are typically fire roads as such. And you can find those in other areas as well that allow vehicle access, limited vehicle access. So you're not having to worry about traffic, but they're built, designed so that vehicles are able to roll over them, which lends itself, doesn't make it totally possible, but lends itself to wheelchair access. Doesn't make it necessarily ADA qualified by grade, but it makes it so a lot more people can access it. So this is just one, Army Corps of Engineers. They're places for you to just search out. You can go on the internet and the Army Corps of Engineers has a website and shows where all of their dams are around the US. So that's one resource. We can turn to the next slide, please. The Mass Audubon has done a tremendous amount to make their trails accessible. Not all, but it's an ongoing initiative within the Mass Audubon properties. And this here in Norfolk is called an all-persons trail. You notice on the right, there's a rope going between these posts. And that provides some added guide for those with visual impairments. And there's some Braille labels. This addresses people who have learned how to read Braille, but you will discover as you start interacting with people within the the community of visual impairments, that many of the people who are visually impaired became visually impaired later in their life. And they did not get Braille training. They're never going to get Braille training. And this is where audio interpretation, having places that you can give headsets for people to use audio interpretive signs to be able to see more of their environment. Notice also there's green on the edge, there's light color here, and that helps with people with visual impairments. The path is packed, it's not paved. You don't have to pave everything to make it accessible, but this is firm packed, it's crushed stone dust, and at least at Stony Brook, they took all of the steps out in the entire area. So I call it stroller friendly. Doesn't meet ADA guidelines everywhere through the property, but it makes it so if you are in a wheelchair, you may need a support person to push you through some of those, but at least for a portion of it, it is completely handicapped accessible. Can we move to the next slide? US Fish and Wildlife has fish hatcheries, I'm pretty sure throughout the state and absolutely around other parts of the country. And this is another accessible, this is another, it's another piece, another type of trail. Notice it's a woodland trail. It doesn't have the crushed stone dust. There actually are some rocks in that. There's no particular preparation for the surface, but it is for the most part, not too many roots and not too many rocks. It's a loop trail. It's about a 1 mile loop trail here. And they make it clear when you start the distance. So you can see it's a 0.8 mile. And so you get some understanding of what you're getting into when you start on this loop. I have pointed out to the folks at this fish hatchery that they need to address the handrails. There are stairs. For some people who are not wheelchair bound, they need railings on stairs. And if they're not, so that you can get your whole hand around those railings, people with mobility challenges are going to be limited. They're not going to be safe to go down those stairs or even up the stairs. So paying attention to your railings, either having them like stainless steel round or wood round, think rounded home stair railings, anything that you need to get your whole hand around it to be able to safely support yourself if you are going up and down stairs and you have balance issues, which includes older people and very little young people and people, grandparents, or anything, a person with cognitive or other disabilities. A firm handhold is a really essential thing. Can we move to the next slide? The Ashland Town Forest in Ashland, Massachusetts. Here's an example of an old cart path. And I have come across old cart paths everywhere I go. It really is amazing the number of old cart paths that you will find in open space. This cart path does not mean that every single trail in the Ashland Town Forest is a cart path. There are others that are more challenging. But this section is, for a distance, a very good path. And historically, it's where people went with wheeled vehicles, wagons. And so they needed to be maintained and pretty accessible. They're fairly wide. They're really quite recognizable. You can also notice there typically are stone walls on either side of these cart paths. They were helpful for making your way, and also so you didn't get lost in snowstorms, is my understanding. So look for old cart paths on your property, and you may highlight those as handicapped friendly, that they have the standard of what I call an easy walk, that is, remember, not too many roots or rocks, relatively level, firm footing with something of interest along the way. Next slide, please. There we have town commons, very, very lucky throughout all of New England. Town commons are very, very common. And or town greens or town parks. And by their nature, these town commons were used as grazeland. So they tend to be either mostly in the center of towns. They tend to be relatively flat. And many of them do have paved or some kind of flat walking paths. You notice in this picture, this is my own town in Bellingham, and there are benches. Many people with mobility and other challenges have less stamina. And so providing benches, whether it's along your rail trail or whether it's along a town common or other town park, is a huge part of making your places accessible. And this includes people who are older and families with young children. So giving them a place to sit is a huge part of making it accessible for a various number of populations. Next slide. We often don't realize that cemeteries of various types, I can't even say where cemeteries, this one happens to be in Mendon, Massachusetts, but almost every community has cemeteries. Some are privately owned, some are more publicly owned, but they often provide either a paved or a access that they can use that will lend themselves to the public. And for that, they're not typically going to have benches. You need to be mindful that these spaces are specifically designed as ways of remembrance first. So if there is a funeral going on, it is up to us as visitors to be mindful of that, stay out of the way. Many of these places have signs that will give you rules about when they're open, typically dawn to dusk, and they usually do not welcome dogs. So stop by your town hall. They'll have a cemetery commission very often that you can ask and get more details. If we can turn to the next slide. Lots of towns and cities have arboretums, and notice that they often have signs that will help identify, but they'll also have benches like in this picture. Notice this is a crushed stone dust. It is not, this is in Acton. It's not completely handicapped accessible, but it lends itself to all of these standards of what I call an easy walk. This one happens to be in Acton. So next slide, please. Rail trails are a huge part of providing access, and they are continuing to be developed throughout the state and around the country, actually. Again, notice for visually impaired, there's green on the outside of the rail trail, and then a lighter color, a different color that help with visual impairments. Completed rail trails by their nature are handicapped accessible. They will have curb cuts that will make it easier for people in wheelchairs to access these rail trails. I know right in my area for getting to marginalized populations, we had just heard about from Latino. Within my community, we've got both Milford and Woonsocket just over the line in Rhode Island. Both have rail trails that are right accessible or even go right through the middle of the downtown that are accessible by foot. You do not need a car to be able to use these, and they are wide. There's room for strollers, there's room for bikes, there's room for skateboards, many different populations, and they are well used. So look for your rail trails, especially Western Mass. You have rail trails, and that's where you can point people to, or work on creating some within some of your spaces. And those are going to be more in your valleys. But even if you've got mountainous, hilly, you're still going to have low trails. And that's where the railroads went. Look for where there's abandoned rail lines and start working on developing those if you haven't already. Next slide. I'm going to give you quick design fails. This was Acadian National Park. Wonderful, wonderful stainless steel, but look where the stainless steel stops, 4 steps before the beach. So yeah, you might be able to walk yourself down that stone wall, but otherwise, if you're on the wrong side of that, you're going to be stuck 4 steps before you can get to the beach. So that's a design fail, or maybe an installation fail. Regardless, it prohibits access. The next slide, please. This is another really difficult example. Lots of places use post and rail. So this place at the Delaware Water Gap offered, I don't know if they thought they were offering handicapped access. It's paved there, but I couldn't get my hand even halfway around this railing. It was next to impossible to manage. Next slide, please. And so last, I want to talk about hiking poles and how they can make a difference in saying yes to more challenging trails. You might consider having loner hiking poles with your organization. If you give people an opportunity to practice their use, provide video instruction for using straps and appropriate height adjustments, plus perhaps giving a simple how-to for walking, descending, and ascending steps. And I'll stop here and turn that back over to Alex.
All right, thank you so much, Marjorie. That was a really, really informative presentation.
Thank you.
All right, so now we're going to begin our Q&A session. It's just to remind y'all how this will work. Thanks to those of you who've already messaged us some questions, but we'll be reopening the chat now so that you can message everyone. So feel free to drop a question in the chat or to raise your hand and I'll call on you to unmute, and you can ask one or all of our speakers a question. Let's see, I can get us started with one of the questions we got sent in. This one's from Shyla Davis for Dr. Estrella Luna. What role do infrastructure-based systems play in exclusionary experiences for EJ communities?
That's a very interesting question. I love getting interesting questions. I feel like I would need some clarification on when you were thinking about infrastructure-based systems, like what exactly did that mean to you, right? So if we're talking, because there are issues that, with like utility issues and things like that, and that would be very different than communications infrastructure. So it's hard to answer the question without knowing specifically what kinds of infrastructure you're thinking about. Let's be real, we need infrastructure. We live in New England. It's cold. It's cold here. It is really cold here. So we do need ways to heat our buildings. Do we have to do it in the way that we have been? No, not at all. But in terms of thinking about open access to green spaces, protected open spaces, there does need to be some more creative and bold ways of thinking about infrastructure that allows for that. And Marjorie, do you have a sense of what that might mean?
I do a little bit.
That would be helpful.
I would suggest that you look at signage, because signage is included in infrastructure, making it visible. I would especially point to look at your parking lots and see, are they safe places? I notice any place where there's handicapped access, there's typically when you snowplow, the snowplows end up putting the snow in the handicap spaces. You've just eliminated access for anybody who needs those handicap spaces if the parking area is otherwise not full. Pay attention to your curb cuts and pay attention to, I forget what they're called, but the little dots that help people with visual impairments or low visual abilities to be able to sense that they're coming to a spot that they need to pay closer attention to. So those are some real, thank you. Those are some real basic infrastructure things that I think are pretty easy to address.
So if that's
If I
what you were
can-
thinking, that would be.
Yeah, if I can interject, I believe Shyla has their hand raised to
Well, maybe
provide
Shyla,
some
you could,
clarification.
that would be awesome. Could you clarify?
Yeah, well, thank you for your initial thoughts, and where you went with it is interesting to hear as well. And I agree that those are definitely critical. I was thinking more in the scale of New England's history being largely run by factories and mills, and the structure of the mill town is very common, those large, dense communities where there's lots of small scale living, you know, big buildings to house many people, when there were workers in the mills and factories living very close by to where they worked so they could walk there. And then the factory owners and the more wealthy living on the outskirts of town in those large Victorian buildings with, you know, large driveways and carports and more wealthy means to access outside of that town area and being in a healthier spot, usually up on a hill and not in the shroud of smoke from the factory. So they had better health and they weren't living in those cramped conditions. So I was thinking more of that because we still see those buildings are still standing, and that's still the way that a lot of towns in this area are structured, where low income, high density housing is focused in a downtown center, not as easily accessible to those outskirts and those open space areas, you know, that weren't built into the town when it was first there.
So yeah, it's so, you know, part of what you're referring to, where people live and how people live and how those spaces are structured has always been a marker for marginalization and privilege, right? And the longer history, it's even weirder than you think. Like, it actually used to be that living up on a hill was actually where marginalized peoples lived, because it's harder to get up a hill like that in the longer history of things. But as transportation technology improved, you know, more privileged people can move further and further away from noxious area, you know, noxious land uses, right? Now, what we live with today, with wealthier, more whiter and privileged people being able to live in what they think is the country, you know, that's what the suburbs were conceived of, and to distance themselves from other marginalized groups, so people of color, immigrants, other unwanted, undesirable peoples. That is just a legacy of the way that sort of the European colonized mindset and social systems operated, right? So we have to dismantle that way of thinking. Number one of those ways to do that is through, and Lucas mentioned it in his presentation, you know, improved transportation infrastructure. You know, can we get low-cost public transportation, affordable public transportation out to some of the public open spaces that existed, some of the spaces that Marjorie showed us in her in her presentation. If you go to Europe, you will often find actually that there will be shuttle buses from a train station to some kind of park or open space. So there are ways to deal with the transportation infrastructure issue so that people can live in the places that are affordable to them. For immigrant groups in particular, and especially refugee groups. I actually wrote about this in a book a couple of years ago. Refugees really do thrive. Well, they can persist and thrive when they live in communities with folks who speak their language and have their cultural, religious, share cultural and religious attributes. And so we want those dense spaces. By the way, they're more climate change friendly anyways. Just to put that out there, all of you living out in the suburbs are what's killing the planet. But we want those spaces. We don't have to settle for exclusion of people who live in cities or in denser urbanized spaces from the open spaces that we have access to and that we've created in the rest of the state and the rest of New England.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Yeah, thank you both for those thoughtful responses. Karen Rosso, I see you have your hand raised. Would you like to unmute and ask our speakers a question?
Hi, thank you. This is really great and giving me tons and tons of ideas and things to think about. I had years ago been a beekeeper who, there was one year when Suffolk County held a country fair where the horse track was. And so all the vendors came from more rural environments, and they brought things like chicks and ducklings. And the immigrant community in Revere, it was like we didn't speak the same language, but this was something they could completely relate to. And they were buying trays full of these little chicks and ducklings. And all I could think of is they're not zoned for that where they live, but that in addition to Black, brown, Native people originally being much more connected to the natural world than European Americans, the immigrants, as you had said, I have a feeling often come from rural places, and then they're shipped to these cities where everything about the lifestyle is foreign to them. I'm actually thinking, even along the lines of when we have conservation restrictions for people to preserve their land in rural places like my town is Princeton, that perhaps there could be some incentive to include like immigrant villages on that land. That's all. Thanks.
I don't know if you want a response to that, Alex. I would just say a couple of things. There is a fantastic opportunity that I think our suburban and rural spaces in New England and in Massachusetts in particular have to rethinking their relationship to immigrants in particular, if for no other reason than to be prepared, well, for two reasons, to be prepared to accept peoples who are climate migrants, which is going to be an issue. But also let's be honest with ourselves. Many of our older, whiter communities are older and they're losing their younger populations. And which means, especially if you think about those towns that rely so heavily on volunteer labor, who is going to be the volunteer firefighters? Who is going to do the volunteer work for the town management if you're not opened up to attracting younger and very likely immigrant populations? So, and through that, part of what you're saying, Karen, is there's a real opportunity to rethink our relationship to land and our relationship to the environment with that, for those people who do come from more rural places, or for people who come from urbanized spaces where it's not as urban and rural is not so segregated as it is, or as it has become here in the United States.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that question and for that response. Okay, the next person I saw with a hand raised was Sally F. If you want to unmute and ask.
Certainly. What a wonderful afternoon discussions. Thank you so much. This is for Jackie and Lucas. I was in touch with Afro Outdoors in Boston, and no one wanted to come down to Mansfield to lead a walk. So that's fine. I got that. Is there anybody in Brockton of Loma?
Yeah, so our well, we have a chapter forming in Eastern Mass. Melanie, I can put her information in the chat, and she leads outdoor outings in Eastern Mass.
Oh, that would be great.
Yeah.
I'll see what I can put together. That would be wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank you. Yeah. So, I'm on the open space committee. My opening statement in my application was that our open spaces are being vastly underutilized by people of color. We need to fix that. So I'd like to organize some walks with people and advertise it and so on. So thank you. Thank you so much. Take my hand down.
Can I respond to organizing walks?
Mhm.
Mostly, well, I have a Facebook group, Easy Walks, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and beyond. And people are always saying they're looking for walks. And what I encourage them, because we aren't a nonprofit, I'm just a Facebook page. If you want to organize a walk, there are things that you need to think about. One of them is liability. And having a nonprofit, which I'm guessing Latino Outdoors, that you've got an umbrella organization, is that true?
Yeah, so we are part of a nonprofit. Latino Outdoors itself is not considered a nonprofit. Our partner, our financial backer is community. Jackie, can you help me here? I can't think of it.
Yeah, so our fiscal sponsor is Community Initiatives, which is a 501c3 out of California.
We are subject to like their liability form. So
Excellent. It's
we
just
have-
for any of these organizations, if you have some kind of an umbrella organization, you're going to be able to be covered with an insurance policy. Putting out any kind of group walk, there is some risk. I mean, being outdoors, there is some risk. And I'm just going to encourage you all. I don't encourage people within my group to say, I'm going to go somewhere, meet me. If you want to have a meetup group, you can do that, but there's a liability concern. So any of you who have that umbrella or within your organization as a nonprofit, you've got an advantage to be able to offer that. You can also invite other people to participate with you, and that will help with group walks. But I just caution people to be mindful of that. And we live in a litigious society, so to be mindful of that. And I absolutely encourage you to plan group walks. Yeah, you can ask people to sign a waiver of liability. It just helps if you have some kind of organization behind you and you're not just an individual saying, hi, we're going off on a group walk.
I'm part of the Mansfield Open Space Committee for the town, so it would be under that umbrella. But thank you very much for those words of caution.
Great.
Okay, I just want to let everyone know that due to time constraints, we probably only have time for 1 or 2 more questions, but we'll get in all we can. And these are great conversations. If you'll want to continue them, I would encourage you to come to our networking session, which will be immediately after this Q&A. Next with their hands raised, I see Heather W.
Hello. Hi, I'll turn on the video here. I know some of you in this meeting. I'm Heather. I'm with the Westfield River Watershed Association and with the Appalachian Mountain Club Conservation Committee. And we do a lot of cleanups around the river. Westfield River is huge. And one of our challenges is we used to have some advocates that would work with us for the homeless communities that live around the river in Agawam prior to doing cleanups. So they would know we're coming and we could be respectful of their spaces. And that was great. So we wouldn't touch their things, but yet there's a lot of trash that gets left on there by other people that we want to clean up. A lot of trash, tons of trash. So to help the people that live there, it's mostly a low income, Latinx community, and they like to go there. They have picnics and barbecues along the river, but we feel like we can't make that space safe for them if we can't clean up some of the stuff there. We can't clean up some of there's all kinds of living materials that get abandoned and left behind year to year where the homeless are. So we want to make that space safe and clean for the community folks to swim in the water where it's safe to swim. But yet at the same time, we are lacking a good resource of a person to be an advocate for us, for the homeless community that live down there in tents for a great number of months during the year. So if you guys have any ideas for that, that would be helpful to me.
Did you see Lucas's note? He's offering to communicate with you, Heather. in the
So
chat.
something that I have found through my just personal experience is, Lucas, could you mute yourself for like a second? Sorry, look, so weird feedback. Something that I've experienced, I've worked at a wastewater treatment facility in Chicopee, and there would be people that would stay at next to the outfall center along the Chicopee River at the intersection with the Connecticut. And people would be homeless living there, even though there was the outfall just 100 meters away, you know, in the river, and people would go and swim there and whatnot. And I would always be like, why would someone come and like stay here? Why would people come and access? But it's because they didn't know that that was there, because there's no signs, no like outward like postings of just that those things were occurring there. And so I feel like, at least from my personal experience, I feel like it would be helped to even just have like a sign being like, oh, well, just so you know, this is like an active homeless and camp, just to be mindful of that. But I don't know if anyone else has any other ideas. That's just something that I know if I came across that type of thing, I'd be like, oh, okay, cool. So like I'll stay away from that area and then stick to my side.
And well, yeah, you're right. Sometimes it can be divided. Like some of the homeless, the active homeless areas are to the side, and sometimes it is a kind of a clear path for everybody else. You know, we've kind of cleared open paths. So we want people to feel safe getting to the river. So we've opened paths and cleared some brush and made it very safe for areas so people can, you know, they're not going to put, you know, tents right there on this little path, but they could see that this is a path people use for the river. But it's still close enough where sometimes there's people that just put tents right on the spaces where the people are trying to do the picnicking. And it's hard to say, okay, if you're going to be homeless, stay there, so we don't interfere with your life. So but we did have a great advocate who used to go down and used to talk to like a couple of weeks in advance, and then the week before we would come out and just say, if you don't want us to touch anything, you know, please, this is what you can do, you know, leave something out front, you know, so we know that, or a certain thing, there would be a mark, so we wouldn't touch their things and cause any problems. We don't want to make these people upset for whatever their reasons are for staying there, but we also want to make sure we don't have all this stuff getting into the river and just all kinds of stuff you couldn't imagine. I mean, there's actually a bunker somebody has down near the river. It's incredible. So, but our biggest problem is we really need to have somebody do the advocacy. We can't find the right type of people.
So Heather, I first I want to commend you for your sensitivity to people who are unhoused and you oftentimes relegated. There's some choice for some people, oftentimes relegated to spaces like that because that's where they feel safe and where they have community. What, you know, so part of what you're pointing to is, again, these are the social problems. These are rooted in social problems, right? Why do we not have housing for people? So I don't have a specific name or organization out where you're at, but you may want to explore some of the housing first advocates who might be able to help liaise, but also help work with you as an advocate and become advocates for housing first solutions for unhoused peoples, for peoples with various types of mental health and substance abuse disorders, so that you reduce the problem generally. I mean, the ideal is that you have fewer of these conflicts, right? The other suggestion, just as a quick thing, is create a relationship with somebody who's well respected in that community. This is how we do research in unhoused communities, is we create a relationship with somebody who can be your liaison within their community. And there oftentimes is, particularly where there are encampments, there is a person who's been there long enough that they're trusted by the folks who live there. And those are the people actually that you probably want to work with, and that you're going to have more of a long-term relationship with.
I hate to cut off a good conversation, but we are a bit over time for our webinar. So I want to move us to some just end materials real quick. So I'm gonna plug our evaluation form one more time. The link will be available in the chat. Like I said, these evaluations are incredibly helpful to us, just for making these webinars the best they can. So please just take a couple minutes to give us your feedback. We hope you'll all join us next week on Thursday, February 17th for week 3, the climate context of your community. We have 2 speakers joining us. Melissa Peters will discuss the utilization of open space in an urban setting and share her experiences as the Director of Community Planning in Cambridge, Mass. Josh Rapp, a conservation scientist at Mass Audubon, will discuss how the Climate Smart Forestry Initiative promotes healthy forests and works to make forests an active part of the climate change solution. Also, be sure to follow us on social media to stay up to date with the Open Space Network and all our offerings. And please join us at, for online networking at 1:35 on the same Zoom link. We might, just because we ran a couple minutes over, we might start that closer to like 1:37-ish, but approximately 1:35 on the same Zoom link. We've altered our networking sessions in response to feedback we received on last week. So hopefully it can facilitate even more conversations. The networking sessions provide a great opportunity to meet other attendees and answer some of these questions that we've been discussing so far. And yeah, hope you all will join us soon. You can feel free, if you want to stay for networking, to stay on this link, grab some water, stretch your legs, and I'll see you all soon.